On Christmas Eve, 1961, a chemist in Czechoslovakia sat at his kitchen table and built a machine out of his son's toy construction set, a bicycle dynamo, and spare parts from a children's electric train. He was not trying to launch a global industry. He was trying to solve one narrow technical problem that had frustrated him for years. How do you cast a piece of plastic soft enough to sit directly on a human eyeball without hurting it? That was the whole job. Get the plastic right, go to bed. What nobody knew that night was that this homemade contraption, spinning in a kitchen in Prague while the rest of the country slept, would eventually put soft lenses on the eyes of more than 150 million people worldwide, reshape professional sports, change military eyewear standards, build a multi-billion-dollar cosmetic industry around the color of the human iris, and quietly become one of the most overlooked sources of plastic pollution on the planet. The machine was the spin casting device that created the modern contact lens. And the story of how it got there starts almost 700 years earlier, in a world where bad eyesight didn't just blur your vision. It ended your career. Florence, Italy, 1280. If you were a monk copying manuscripts, a merchant reading ledgers, or a jeweler inspecting gemstones in the late 13th century, your working life had a hard expiration date, and it had nothing to do with your health or your skill. It had to do with your eyes. Presbyopia, the natural hardening of the eye's lens that makes close-up focus difficult, sets in for almost everyone somewhere in their 40s. Today, that's a trip to the pharmacy for reading glasses. In 1280, it was a professional death sentence. Scribes who had spent 30 years mastering elegant Latin script found themselves squinting at pages they could no longer read clearly. Merchants who had built businesses on careful bookkeeping started making costly errors. Skilled artisans, the kind of craftsmen an entire guild depended on, were forced into early retirement, not because their hands had lost their skill, but because their eyes had lost their focus. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. In a world without cheap paper, without printed books, without any mass system of education, the people who could read and calculate were disproportionately valuable and disproportionately old. Monasteries in particular had a problem. Their entire economic and spiritual function depended on literate men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s copying texts hour after hour by candlelight. And a huge percentage of them were going functionally blind for close work at exactly the point in their careers when their judgment and training were most valuable. Some had already found a partial workaround. Monks used what were called reading stones, polished hemispheres of clear quartz or beryl that you laid directly on top of a page. Looking through the curved glass magnified the text underneath. It worked, sort of. You couldn't move it easily, you couldn't wear it, and it only helped with objects sitting flat on a table. It was better than nothing. It was not a solution. Then, sometime around 1286, in either Pisa or Florence, somebody had an idea that nobody can definitively take credit for. We know this invention happened because of a second-hand account. A Dominican friar named Giordano da Pisa gave a sermon in Florence in February of 1306, and in it he said something remarkable, almost in passing. He mentioned that it was not yet 20 years since the art of making eyeglasses had been discovered, and that he himself had met and spoken with the man who first invented them. And then he never named him. That's it. That's the entire paper trail for one of the most consequential inventions in human history.
No patent, no workshop record, no surviving portrait. Just one monk in a sermon casually referencing a conversation he'd had with a man whose name he apparently didn't think was worth writing down. Historians have spent centuries trying to fill in the blank. A 17th century inscription in a Florence church credited a man named Salvino d'Armate, but that claim has never been verified, and most scholars now consider it fabricated. What we do know from actual surviving records is more mundane and more interesting. The Venetian Glassmakers Guild, based on the island of Murano, was already producing small polished glass discs by the late 13th century. And in 1301, the guild's statutes formally regulated the production of what they called roidi d'oli, discs for the eyes.
2 of these discs, mounted in frames and hinged together, riveted at the bridge so they could pinch onto the nose, became the first pair of eyeglasses. Somebody in the Venetian glass trade, almost certainly a craftsman rather than a scholar, had figured out that the same curved glass technique used for reading stones could be shrunk down, paired up, and worn on the face. The design that came out of Venice and Pisa in those first years was crude by any modern standard. There were no arms that hooked over the ears, because that innovation wouldn't arrive for another 400 years. Early spectacles simply balanced on the bridge of the nose, or were tied to the head with ribbon, or in some cases held up with one hand while the other hand turned pages. They were also entirely one purpose. Every early lens was convex, ground to correct presbyopia, the farsightedness of aging eyes. If you were nearsighted, born unable to see anything at a distance, there was still nothing for you. That gap wouldn't close for another 170 years. In 1451, a German cardinal and scholar named Nicholas of Cusa became the first person on record to describe using concave lenses, ground the opposite way, to correct nearsightedness. It had taken the better part of 2 centuries to figure out that vision problems came in more than one flavor. Here's the detail that most people miss about why eyeglasses spread as fast as they did once they existed. In 1440, Johannes Gutenberg built his printing press in Mainz, Germany. And within decades, books went from rare, expensive, hand-copied objects to something a growing merchant class could actually afford. Literacy rates climbed. Reading, for the first time in history, became a mass activity rather than a specialized skill reserved for clergy and nobility. And that created a problem eyeglasses were perfectly positioned to solve. More people reading meant more people discovering, usually somewhere in their 40s, that they suddenly couldn't. The printing press didn't just spread books, it spread demand for spectacles right alongside them, and the 2 industries grew up together, feeding each other, one putting text in front of people's faces, and the other making sure aging eyes could still see it. By the 1500s, spectacle making had become an established trade across Europe, with dedicated guilds in Nuremberg, Venice, and later London and Paris. Wearing glasses became a visible marker of learning and status. Portraits of scholars, judges, and merchants from this era frequently show them posed with spectacles in hand, not because they needed them for the painting, but because holding a pair of glasses was shorthand for intelligence and literacy, the 16th century equivalent of a diploma on the wall.